What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's Q&A. Thank you so much for your questions, as always. And also, as always, if I didn't get to your question this week, then just go ahead and post it on the bottom of this Patreon page and post any new questions you have as well. And don't forget to like all the questions that you want answered, because I answer them in order of how many little heart thingies they have. So without further ado, John Brendel asks, "Hey Matt, what are your current plans regarding moving to Japan? When and how do you want to do it? Could you imagine staying in Japan forever?" I guess I do have plans right now to maybe go to Japan after I graduate from college, and we have some business ideas. I'm not going to talk about those here, but yeah, I think I'll probably end up moving to Japan in a year or two after college, and I don't know how long I'll stay there. Probably at least 5 to 10 years. I can imagine staying there forever. I don't really have any strong feelings either way. I kind of will just have to see how things play out when I get there. But I will say, I guess, that before, when I imagined me going to Japan, I really imagined myself kind of trying to assimilate into the culture and become Japanese and that sort of stuff. And I definitely don't see myself trying to do that now. Because, when I think about it, I'm not really even assimilated into my own culture here in America. I've always been someone who kind of just did my own thing, and I definitely think I'm going to be the kind of person who just does my own thing when I'm in Japan. I'm going to have to go and find, friends that are just like me, that are not your typical, run-of-the-mill people. not to say that in like an arrogant way. I just mean like I'm pretty not normal, and so, you kind of also have to be not normal to really get along with me. So I think that if I can find my niche in Japan and maybe some gaijin friends that are also really similar to me, then I could probably really enjoy myself living there. And I guess that's more why I'm more open to it now, is because the period when I was really turned off from that was when I was thinking about how difficult it would be for me to really assimilate, or even if I could do it, that I wouldn't really want to. So now that I kind of got over that and realized I'm not even assimilated into my own culture, I realize it doesn't really matter that much where I am physically, you could say. So Nico asks, "Hey Matt, I'm wondering if you have a wean off program to let go of Anki along the way of learning Japanese. I think I still have a lot of things to learn using SRS as aid, but reaching 2 years with this, I will like to start thinking that there's an end to it, as my immersion gets to resemble to just life and doing stuff in Japanese." So basically, when and how should you wean yourself off the SRS? So I think this depends a lot on what your goals are. Me personally, it's been 6 months since I completely deleted my giant, SRS deck and stopped using Anki completely. And since that time, I've had a lot of realizations about what Anki is definitely not necessary for and what I didn't need it for, and also what it's really good for and what I kind of did need it for, because I've noticed that I've forgotten a lot of things that I used to know that I kind of still wish that I knew. But at the same time, I recognize that a lot of those things are really niche and obscure and not practical on a day-to-day basis. Like, it was really nice before when I could read tons of super obscure kanji that Japanese people couldn't read. I would actually know the exact meanings of really rare words, and so it was really easy to read super difficult, like, old texts, even though I don't do that often. When I did want to, I could just pop it open and I could read it. And also, like, the names of celebrities I don't see that much and stuff. Basically, just having a lot of knowledge. It doesn't have that much practical benefit. And of course, you won't forget the things that you really engage with day to day. But I realized that if you want to maintain a very high level of knowledge about the language, and you're not dedicating your entire life to that, like, let's say you're like me, and you're going to school, and school pretty much has nothing to do with Japanese, and then I'm doing MIA, and that mostly is all done in English, so I'm not doing that much related to Japanese. I don't have that much time each day to spend on Japanese, and so when I had the SRS, I could still maintain all this obscure knowledge, whereas before I'd have to be like, if I didn't have the SRS and I wanted to maintain that level of knowledge, I'd probably have to be living in Japan and like reading old texts all the time and all this other stuff. So it actually makes maintaining a huge broad range of knowledge very stress-free. So if you're like me and you're kind of a Japanese nerd and you like that kind of stuff, then I'm realizing now that I probably want to keep using the SRS forever. And I've slowly been using it again. You just have to make sure that you're healthy about it. You don't overdo it. Like I never want to spend more than 30 minutes a day repping. But 30 minutes a day repping goes a long way, especially when you're using the low-key Anki setup. So you are never doing more reps than you need to. And so if you're like me, then you probably never want to let go of the SRS. But if you just want to be practical and be able to watch anime and be able to have conversations, then you can probably definitely drop the SRS like pretty early. And in terms of how to go about dropping the SRS, I mean, really, when you think you want to start doing that, first just start adding less and less cards each day. Like if you're adding 10 cards a day on average, start adding 7 or 8 cards a day on average, and then go to 5 cards a day on average, and then go to 1 or 2 cards a day on average, and then go to only adding cards every couple of days, and then stop adding new cards and just do your reps for a while, and then you can stop doing your reps, you know? Pretty intuitive, I'd say. And the other thing that, you know, I've experienced is that if you've been using an SRS for the entire time learning Japanese, you really just don't know what it's like to not use an SRS. I mean, you know what it's like, but it's really hard to grasp how much the SRS is doing for you, right? Because it's only really after you go without it for a while that you get a sense of what am I missing? What am I not missing? So what I would actually recommend at this point is if you are considering dropping the SRS, maybe just do it for 6 months. Just drop it and then see where you're at. And I think you'll have a lot of perspective after that on what was Anki doing for you, what was it not doing for you, and then you can kind of restart. Maybe you just are going to keep writing it out because you're like, yeah, I'm totally good, I don't need it. And maybe you'll realize, okay, well, I was using it for all these things, I really only need it for these 1 or 2 things, and I'm going to just do that instead, and you can kind of get a fresh start. So I would say taking a long SRS break, including stopping repping, might be a good idea if you're getting to that point where you're considering dropping Anki, and that will really give you some perspective, I'd say. So Simo Nexo asks, "Hi Matt, I have a question about going through the Tae Kim grammar guide. Basically, you said that before starting sentence mining in the wild, it would be better to grasp some basic knowledge of the grammar behind the language in order to improve our immersion time." Definitely. So in other words, does this imply that we should read all of the grammar guide, about 355 pages, including advanced topics? I was wondering if it was better to do the essential grammar first and do sentence cards of the examples, as you suggested in a previous video, to finish the grammar guide later on, maybe stage 2 or 3. I mean, honestly, it doesn't really matter that much either way. You're probably fine just doing the essential grammar section. Another way to think about this is that it might be better to skim a few different grammar resources rather than to read one very thoroughly, because in a way, it's impossible to accurately describe Japanese grammar in English. What you're doing when you're describing Japanese grammar in English is you're kind of turning the Japanese grammar into a mental model. And this mental model is made out of English building blocks because it's being presented in English. So basically, you're taking English building blocks because that's all you have to work with if you're writing in English. And you're trying to build a sort of structure that resembles Japanese grammar or describes Japanese grammar accurately. And different grammar guides do this better than others. I'd say Tae Kim does a pretty good job. But at the end of the day, it's still not the real thing. It's not the territory, it's just a map. And the map has a hard limit on how accurate it can be because it's made out of English building blocks. And so, in order to really understand Japanese grammar directly or intuitively or accurately, you have to understand it in Japanese the first time. And so you can't start with English and use your understanding of English to build these structures around and learn it through translation. It's literally impossible to get all the way there. And so if you have a really good grammar guide like Tae Kim, that although you're still building blocks out of English and you're basically just learning in your head how to translate Japanese into little English structures, like basically the reason why you can tell, not for sure, but one hint that Tae Kim might be doing a better job of doing this than other grammar guides is that the English is very unnatural in Tae Kim, right? Like you look at the English translations and it's unnatural. So by not being held back by the limitation of having to make natural English as the translations, he's actually able to get closer to the reality of Japanese, but it's still not all the way there, because it's just impossible to actually convey the exact nuance of what Japanese grammatical structures mean in English. It's just impossible because they're fundamentally too different. And so Tae Kim is kind of a double-edged sword, because when you read it, it gives you this framework that really helps you understand a lot of your immersion right away and really jump in. But at the same time, because it's such a robust model and it does work so well, it's really hard to see outside of it and see the limitations of it. And it is limited, like I just said. There are certain things that in Japanese, if you interpret it through the way that Tae Kim tells you to, you kind of get a limited perspective on it, or you will, maybe there's one structure that can mean like 3 subtly different things, but Tae Kim just says that they all just mean this one thing. And so it kind of blinds you in a way. And this isn't a permanent thing. You eventually figure it out, but investing in it too much up front, it can help you make a lot of gains in the short term, but it can actually slow you down later when you have to manually like come to the realization that you are making false assumptions that Tae Kim kind of walked you into. And so if you were kind of, instead of really investing into one grammatical resource, you just kind of roughly skim a bunch, then by seeing the same type of structures explained different ways, you kind of get a sense of, not directly, you still can only get it directly from actually acquiring Japanese through immersion. But if you read 3 explanations of a structure and all of them are different, then you can kind of say like, okay, well, maybe it's something in between these 3, right? Or at least you can grasp that none of them are the true one because they're all different. And so that the true one must be somewhere that you can't grasp. And so I think that could be a good strategy. You could still make it Tae Kim your base. Like you could skim through the essential section of Tae Kim, and then if you ever get stumped, you could just look up in the moment other grammatical things. There's other websites where you can just basically search for grammatical stuff and look it up like that. So I think that might be a good strategy. It's going to feel very unsatisfying because you're going to crave a crystal clear understanding. But that's whenever you think you have a crystal clear understanding, you're really just basically tricking yourself, because what that means is that you translated it into English and you understood the English crystal clear, but that doesn't probably correspond to the original Japanese. So I can put some links for some other grammar guides that you can take a look at, and basically don't get too like worried or detailed about this. Like the thing with the grammar is that you just want to, skim it, do it a quick dirty job, pick up some stuff here and there so that you can get out into the wild and then at least have some idea what you're doing. It's really not the type of thing where you can master, because like I said, it's fundamentally wrong because you're doing it through English. And you don't want that to hold you back too much. So it's finding this balance between, if you go completely organic and read no grammar guides, then it's going to take you a long time to figure out what's going on in your immersion, because you really just have nowhere to start. You have nothing to sink your teeth into at all. But if you do too much grammar, then that's really good in the short term because you have all this mental framework you can use to kind of decode the Japanese, but that actually holds you back in the long term, because then you have trouble seeing outside of that mental framework that you built up that's ultimately not completely true. So try to find a balance, and I think a good way to do that, like I said, might be skimming quick and dirty multiple resources. So sorry if that's not a very satisfying answer, but basically skim the essential grammar, make some cards if you feel like it, don't get anal about it, and don't try to make cards for the whole entire thing, and maybe look at some other grammar resources. And I mean, I think it's good to just kind of get the N5 deck or some other deck that doesn't have that much explanations. Just start learning that to get basic vocab, and then if there's things that come up in that deck or in whatever you're learning that you don't understand, then look that up on the spot in some of the other grammar resources, and I'll put some links to those in the descriptions. So basically, make it up yourself. Just go freestyle, find what works for you, and don't worry, because none of it really matters, right? As long as you immerse, your brain's going to figure it all out. So Gaijin Gains asks, hold on, let me go drink some water. I'm curious about pitch accent in regards to names. People, places, businesses, etc. Is this something that you just pick up when your ear is good enough? And how is the pitch accent determined? So very good question here. I will tell you, first of all, that if it's a common name or a place, there is a set accent how to say it. It's normally not something that changes. So like Tokyo is Heiban, it's always Heiban, right? Or like Ito, that name is always Heiban. So there are just set pitch accents in names and places. And another super useful rule, or a principle, is that nearly all place names and the names of people are either Heiban or -3. So Heiban means it's 0, it's flat, Tokyo, right? And -3 means that the accent core, or the kaku, is the third from the last syllable, which means that if it's 3 syllables, then it's going to be a tamadaka, and if it's 4 syllables, then it's going to be on the second one, for example. And so, really, it's just a binary. Is it Heiban or is it -3? So keeping that in mind can make it really easy and to remember, because it's either one or the other. And there aren't any real good resources that you can go to just look this up. There's this one website that lists some of the most popular names and places, and I'll list that in the description. And so that's useful, but it's definitely not comprehensive, and there's no real comprehensive resource. So in a way, yes, you have to just learn it from immersion. But I wouldn't say it's something that you just pick up like unconsciously, because I don't, even when you get really good at pitch accent, I still think a component of it has to be deliberate. But it does get very easy to notice. Like, you get very good at recognizing the pitch. So for me, if I'm watching a show and someone's, name comes up, like Ito or whatever, I'll just take a mental note, like, oh, that's Heiban. I guess Ito is Heiban. And it's always kind of a hypothesis, because it's like, well, maybe I heard it wrong. Maybe that person pronounced it funny or something. But once it comes up again a few more times and it was Heiban every time, then I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess it's really Heiban. So that's, basically the deal, is that there's a lot of things that you're just going to have to pick up from the wild, because there's a lot of slang and things like that where the pitch accent isn't listed in any dictionary. There's a lot of times where what's listed in the dictionary is just wrong. Like, some things I've noticed recently is like sengetsu, so last month. Every single dictionary just lists it as a tamadaka. No dictionary lists it as Heiban, but multiple times recently, I've been watching a movie or a drama, and these are actors that are pro at speaking Hyojungo, and they pronounce it Heiban in sengetsu. And another example is Dei. Dei, if you look it up in the dictionaries, they all just say Heiban, but multiple times recently, I've heard someone say it as Nakadaka, like Dei, Deiga. So, language changes, the dictionaries are 10 to 20 years behind, and you're going to have to learn to rely on your ear if you really want to get perfect. And of course, if you don't care about getting perfect and you just want to get like 90%, that's totally cool. That's still way, you're still getting most of the benefit. There are diminishing returns. So if you're the type of person who's like, well, I'm just going to go what's in the dictionary. If it's not in the dictionary, fuck it. If the dictionary is wrong, fuck it. That could be a very good strategy overall, because you're getting a larger amount of the benefit for a fraction of the work. But if you do want to get perfect, you are going to have to basically do a lot of your own field work and always be doubting. Never trusting anything. Never trust your intuition. Never trust your ears. Never trust the dictionary. Basically, always assume that everything could be wrong, and you're always looking for data that contradicts what you know, or and things like that. Like, that's the kind of mindset it takes if you want to get perfect, which I'm still very far from. But like I said, I'm noticing things all the time, just like Dei and Sengetsu and other patterns and things like that. So a lot of the work has to be done in the wild, I think. So David asks, hello, in your previous videos as well as Q&As, you've mentioned that the amount of daily immersion should be at least 1 hour daily. I started MIA about 3 months ago. Since then, I promised myself not to watch a single anime with subtitles, which I followed through on. Every day, I've been engaging with about 4 episodes of raw anime. I feel like this amount is too small. Should I increase the load and perhaps do 3 or 4 hours of active immersion instead? So this is something that I feel like people have a hard time understanding, because I say it over and over, but they still ask, like, doesn't really seem to sink through to people, is like, at least 1 hour of daily immersion for what? Should you do more for what? What are you trying to accomplish? What is your goal? Is your goal to learn Japanese to, like, basic fluency within 5 years? Is your goal to reach native level within 10 years? Without any sort of that kind of qualification, how could I tell you exactly how much you should be doing? How could I tell you if what you're doing is enough or not? There's no pre-built-in goal to language learning, right? There's there's no limit to how good you can get. There's no limit to how quickly you can improve. There might be a minimum effective dose where if you do minimum of that, or if you do less than that, then you basically don't make any progress at all. And if that's what you're asking about, then I would say, yeah, that's probably about 1 hour daily if you want to make any progress at all. But that still might take you like 5 years to get fluent at that level, to, you know, reach a solid level of fluency, depending on the person and other circumstances and things like that. So should you increase your daily load? Well, that depends on a host of factors. How important is getting good at Japanese to you? What is your final goal? How quickly do you want to reach that final goal? What else do you have going on in your life? How much time do you have? How much would you have to sacrifice in order to do more? That's way too much of a broad, open question that's going to have a different answer for everybody. So if you want to make any progress at all, and you're doing a solid hour of a day plus SRSing and things like that, then yeah, I think you will continue to make progress towards fluency. Do you want to get better quickly? Do you want to make the kind of progress that I made in my initial phase and Katsumoto made and Patrick and Nick and Brit vs. Japan and Ben and those kind of people made? Then you're going to have to do way more than that. You're going to have to be doing 3 or 4, 5, 6 hours every single day. So it's a whole spectrum. So Sumi asks, you talk in your giant Q&A video about letting your reading ability develop too far ahead of your listening ability. Oh, sorry, I think I read that wrong. You talk in your giant Q&A video about how letting your reading ability develop too far ahead of your listening ability is dangerous and it may not be fixable. Have your thoughts on this changed, and would you recommend anything specific that someone in this position could do to truly improve their listening ability? Good question. So I wouldn't say my thoughts on this area have changed, but I would say that they've developed. I just realized that was a really kind of stupid, cringy thing to say. But, I mean, I'd say they didn't change in the sense of they kind of changed trajectory, but I do have more nuance now in the way that I think about it. So 2 things in particular. More and more, mainly from my, analyzing my own first-person experience, I think that the way that you learn the language and the order that you learn things in the language might have close to permanent effects on your language ability in the long term. And so before I was talking about this in terms of if you learn how to read before you learn how to listen, that might have permanent effects on your pronunciation. And I think this is very true. But I think it even extends to things like if you learn how to if you learn anime through anime alone, and that's your brain's base model of what Japanese is like, and then you go and learn how to speak more naturally and colloquially, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, you're not going to have the same exact final results as someone who first learned how to speak naturally and then learned to understand anime later. And what I mean by this is that personally, I learned Japanese through anime and through a lot of reading. And in the first couple of years, I was very heavy on that. And I realized that even now, where I pretty much never watch anime, and I still read novels in Japanese, but I mostly read nonfiction, and I listen to a lot of just natural speech, I still feel that when I speak Japanese without filtering myself at all, or I write Japanese without filtering myself at all, I write in a very kind of poetic way. I use a lot of big words and structures that Japanese people don't use that much in daily speech. And now this isn't necessarily a bad thing because in a way it just makes me sound more elegant. And it's the type of thing where Japanese people have to put in a lot of effort to do that because if they wanted to sound elegant, but I can, and it's kind of funny. A lot of times I let that come through on purpose, and I'm kind of ironic about it and things like that. But basically, the thing is that I'm totally aware of it. I totally know, sorry if I'm all over the place, but basically, it's very popular to hear the argument within the Japanese learning world, oh, if you can't learn from anime, or you'll sound like an anime character. But the argument that is normally made, the reasonings given behind this type of argument is that, oh, you'll think that saying teme and omae is natural, and you'll think that going oi, ora kakkoii ze, oh, ikou ze, oh, ora ichiban sui n dayo, or whatever, like, that you'll talk like that, and you'll think that that's normal. So that is not true at all. If you get a broad amount of immersion, you'll get a very accurate sense of what type of Japanese sounds like what. You'll get a very good sense of what sounds masculine, what sounds feminine, what sounds pretentious, what sounds humble, what sounds, colloquial, and what sounds literary. What makes you sound like a newscaster? What makes you sound like you're uneducated? You'll get a very good sense of this if your immersion is broad and you pay attention. And so for me, I have a very good sense of that. And so if I monitor my Japanese, I can tailor it to sound just how I want. If I want to sound natural, I can sound natural. If I want to sound like an anime character, I can sound like an anime character. If I want to sound like a verbose novelist, I can do that too, which is pretty cool. But the thing is that my base level Japanese, my baseline, is that more poetic, verbose way of speaking, because I read a lot in the beginning, I think. Mostly I read a lot of novels and light novels that tend to be very verbose. And that's like my mind's default mode of Japanese. And then when I want to speak natural, I'm tailoring that to sound natural. And I can do it, but it takes effort. Like when I just open my mouth and speak Japanese, I speak like a book, and it's very funny. And I don't do it because I know it sounds weird, and I can tailor it, but it takes effort to tailor. And this is so basically you have a way of speaking that's the most natural to you when you're basically just not worrying about what anyone is going to think of you or anything like that. Like the way you might talk if you're super drunk, right? And you can't, you're like wobbling around, whatever would come out at that time. There's a way of talking that would be your kind of default baseline. And it's very hard to change that. I'm not saying you can't at all, but it's definitely hard to change that. And the reason why I think this is because in Japanese, there's a million different ways to say any one thing. Not literally a million things, but you know what I mean. And this is true with any language, I think, any, developed language. And so what happens is first you learn a word or a concept or an idea in Japanese, and your brain kind of makes a dictionary entry for that. And then later when you learn other ways of saying it, your mind kind of files them in the same cabinet that it made for that initial entry. So like, let's say you learn the word like sugoku or like totemo, hijoni or whatever. You learn a bunch of those other words, but then your mind always puts them into the same drawer, right? But the drawer has a label on it. Like let's say you have the like sugoku drawer. And because that's the one you learned first. And then you have all the other words like totemo, hijoni, mechakucha, whatever, yatara ni. But because you learned like sugoku first, that's like the name of the cabinet, and all in your brain says there's this word sugoku, and then there's all these synonyms to it, and so all the other words are kind of filed as synonyms of the original word, and so that original word is like at the very base. And so this isn't just for words, this is for structures and everything. And so for me, like I think the way in my brain is if you think of it like a skyscraper, the most foundational layer, or like if you think of it even like a cake, like the bottom layer of the cake is like literary Japanese that I learned through light novels. And then later my brain just filed all the other stuff as synonyms to things like that. And so maybe like nanoda or dearu is just, I'm simplifying it a lot, is like my base way of ending a sentence. And then my brain said like nandayo ne, or like nano ne, or whatever. Like it's like, oh, so that's like the natural way to say nanoda or nanodearu. And so that's good. I know that. And when I think, oh, I want to speak naturally now, that comes to mind very quickly. But I have to think I want to speak naturally now in order to summon up those things. And when I'm not filtering, it's like weird and literary. And so a lot of that might be that just because I'm not living in Japan and I still haven't gotten enough natural immersion. And I do think that if I lived in Japan and got lots of natural immersion, it'd get a lot easier to speak more colloquially, and I get a lot more used to it. But I think it's hard to really change that first layer because it's like a skyscraper, right? It's like you can add on more layers to the top, but you can't just switch out what the bottom layer is because everything is built on top of that. And so I think, and also, like, even if you think about native speakers, like, let's say you grew up in Kyushu and then you moved to Tokyo when you're 18, and then you live in Tokyo and speak nothing but standard Japanese until you're like 45. When you get really angry, you're still going to speak in the dialect from Kyushu that you learned when you were a kid. And, like, for example, my mom, she grew up in New York, and then she lived in Boston after she was New York, lived in New York, and then she moved to Oregon when she was, like, already in her 30s. And today, she completely sounds like she was born and raised on the West Coast of the United States. But when she gets really angry, she still speaks in a New York accent. Only when she's really angry. So there's still somewhere, like, very deep in her mind where the first way she learned how to speak is still kind of that bottom layer. And I don't think you can ever totally switch that out, because it seems like even native speakers can't. Even though for all intents and purposes you can, like, get the other, make it, really practice the ones on top and switch what your default is. It's like, at some base level, I don't think it's ever going to be the same. And I think this is probably even more true for a foreign language, where everything is like a little bit harder and worse. And so I definitely think that the order that you build up your skyscraper or your cake is going to affect your final result. And so if your goal is to be just like a Japanese person, you have to build up your cake the same way that they build up their cake, which is first you learn very colloquial, almost vulgar language, and then you learn more polite language and more things like that. And you'll notice, like, with Japanese people, it's like their default, if they are ever in, like, a situation where they're having an emotional breakdown or they're super drunk and they're not filtering themselves at all, they speak almost like a child would speak, right? Like, very, like, not polite and using things in simple ways and things like that. And so if you want to be like a Japanese person in the sense of when your filter goes down, you speak naturally, then I think you're going to have to learn how to speak naturally first, because that's the only way to make that your true baseline at the very bottom, the thing that comes out first when everything else is turned off. And for me, it's like speaking in a literary verbose way. That's like my very baseline. And so again, practically it doesn't matter that much. And for most people, this doesn't matter at all, because they just want to be, have a basic level of fluency. They want to be able to communicate and not sound incompetent. And so in that case, it really doesn't matter. And you could even say this about pronunciation, right? It's like almost everyone who's studying Japanese, you're not going to sound fully native anyway. You're going to still have a lot of foreignness to the way you speak, no matter how hard you try. So it's really just a matter of how foreign are you going to sound. And if you, and so of course, if you learn how to read before you, and you do a lot of that before your listening abilities are going to develop, then you're going to have worse pronunciation in the long term, most likely, due to all the reasons I explained in that long Q&A video. But does that really matter? Probably not for most people. So my thinking didn't change in the sense that, my thinking went further in that direction of recognizing that the order that you learn things and the order that you get comfortable of certain domains of the language might have close to permanent effects on the way that the language is formulated in your brain from that point onward. But does it matter? Probably not that much for most people. To some people it will. Like, if I could go back in time and I was still going to do Japanese, then I might have done, I would try to focus on colloquial speech, like maybe dramas and a lot of YouTube videos and radio shows, and not kind of stayed away from anime. But I also know that, like I said, for a lot of people, it doesn't matter that much. Like, most people wouldn't mind having their baseline be a kind of verbose way of speaking, where you use lots of, idioms and things like that. And that, like, as long as you can still speak naturally when you want to, like I said, I can still speak naturally when I want to. It's like something I have to do. Just like in English, if you're giving a presentation to the class, or you're doing a public speech, you're not speaking the way that you just speak to your really close friend on the phone or whatever. You're purposely speaking in a certain way to give a certain impression to your audience, and that's normal. There's nothing wrong with that. And so you'll still have the ability to speak naturally in that way, but all I'm saying is it won't be your baseline, and I don't think that's that easy to change. Like, Katsumoto made it sound like, oh, if you just do a little extra immersion, like, hey, you talk to the anime character, go to Japan, just, you live there for a few weeks, and then you'll be totally normal. But I don't think it's that simple on a deep layer. So does it have a huge influence? Yes. Does that matter to you personally? Probably not for most people. Probably as long as they get fluent, then and they can speak and whatever, then that's good enough for them. And for a lot of people, anime is like their main immersion source. And if they couldn't use anime and they had to just use Japanese YouTube videos and like radio shows, then that would be so boring that they wouldn't be able to learn Japanese like at all. So, yeah. So, Osflung asks, hi, how would you approach the different meanings of a word? Let's say, for an instance, you have a card for one meaning of a word, but the same word comes up again in your immersion, but it has another meaning. Should you make another separate card? Well, I remember when this used to happen to me, a lot of times, if you already know one meaning of a word, you already have a mental dictionary entry for it, right? So when it comes up again, you recognize it's like, oh, that's that word that I learned, but oh, that's weird. It seems like it has a different meaning. So because you already have that mental dictionary entry, it's going to be a lot easier to tack on other additional meanings to it. The hardest part is learning the first meaning, just getting this word into your head in any form at all. But once it's there, adding more new ones and tacking on more meanings is pretty easy. So a lot of times you won't need a card. All you'll have to do is look up the word, see that it has another meaning, see what the meaning is, and that will be enough. It will stick. By the next time it comes up, you'll still remember it. And I remember this would happen to me. So when I learned a word that, when I would find a word that I'd already learned, it had a different meaning, I would usually I wouldn't make a card for it because I wouldn't need it. I would just remember it. The next time it would come up with that same new meaning, I would still remember what it was. Now, if a word comes up that you already learned, it has a different meaning, you look it up and you're like, oh, cool, it can also mean this. And then it comes up again later, and you didn't remember it, you're like, oh, wait, I know this had another meaning, but I can't remember it. And you feel like you might forget it again. Then you can make a card for it. So, but I wouldn't make the card the first time. I would just trust yourself the first time that you're going to be able to remember it without the card. And only once that fails, go back and make a card. Remember, it's never too late to make a card. You can always go back and make one later. And there's always a chance that you'll remember it without a card. So you always want to lean on the side of not making a card, because there's a chance that you'll be wasting your time, and it's never too late. So David Johnson asks, is it worthwhile to use MCDs? Not in my opinion. So in case you don't know, before Katsumoto disappeared around 2014, he came up with this, or wait, this is even before that. This is like 2012, I think. Came up with this new type of flashcards called massive closed deletions, MCDs, that he said should totally replace sentence cards. And basically what it is you just take a paragraph of text in the target language and you put that on the front of a card, and then you hide just one word or maybe even just one kanji, so like half a word. And your goal is to read the paragraph and then come up with the one character that's hidden. And he said you don't have to read the whole paragraph, you only have to read as much as you need to fill it in. So if you can just read like one sentence and fill it in, then good, don't read the rest. Like, don't force yourself to read it. That would be too painful and boring. And I tried this for a while, but I found that once the card got mature, I would end up just memorizing the answer to flashcards without actually memorizing the word. So basically the problem is that if you have a whole paragraph of text and you see that card a bunch of times, that your brain just starts to realize like, oh, this is a flashcard. And then it just starts to memorize like what I mean is that it starts to remember that specific flashcard as a flashcard, and it remembers just the answer to the flashcard instead of the word. So basically, Japanese, of course, has a lot of patterns in it, and there is a lot of predictability in it, but you can never predict 100% what a word is going to be if it, like in a paragraph by hiding the word, right? So what I mean is that if you took a random Japanese paragraph from a news article and you hit a word, no matter how good you are at Japanese, you can't know for sure what's going to go in that missing blank, because there could be tons of words that could naturally fit into the blank, because language does have a creative element to it, right? Unless you already know what the person's going to say and you already memorized how they tend to say things, then you can't really know for sure. So what this means is that the card isn't helping you learn the word, it's just helping you remember what word was used in this one specific instance of this one specific paragraph. And so I would start having experiences where the card would come up. Before I even read a single word, my brain, just from the shape of the text on the card, would go, oh yeah, the answer to this one is like this kanji. And then I could force myself to read it, but you don't want to have a card that puts so much on you, right? Your cards should be formatted in a way that it guides you to do the work that you want to be doing with the card. And so if your cards are formatted in such a way that you know the answer before you've done anything that you need to do on the card, that's not ideal at all. It's going to make repping very exhausting because then you feel like you have such a big responsibility to not bullshit yourself. And so, in my opinion, MCDs are a very half-baked idea. They don't do what they're supposed to do at all. Normal sentence cards work way better. But I will say that there are certain times where you're going to want to make production cards or close cards. So, for example, if you are learning Japanese grammar in Japanese, then there's going to be a lot of grammatical terms that you're going to want to learn, like, say, the words for the different types of conjugation forms, or the different types of verbs, or the different parts of speech. And so you might want to make a card that just says, what is, like, in Japanese, like, what is the term for the conjugation form that is blah, 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 you know? Or, like, for the part of speech that is blah, 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 blah. And then you actually come up with the word. That can be a good way to learn the terms and make sure that you really know the terms. You probably also want to make recognition cards where you're recalling the meaning of the term given to it. So that would be like a sentence card. But that's different than an MCD where you're recalling the word in a paragraph. That's actually just you have the definition and you're recalling what the word is. I do think that those can be useful, especially alongside the recognition cards. But those are more for learning specific terminology, similar to what you would do in your native language, and less for trying to just acquire more fundamental vocabulary in the language. I think sentence cards are just fine for that. Gena Smith, you should, next time you ask a question, you should add in how to pronounce your name, because I never know and I'm always wondering. How should I rate monolingual cards in Anki? Should I press good when I can recall full definition? When I understand sentence? When I can understand/translate word in my head? Basically, how to do monolingual reps. Definitely don't try to memorize the definition. Really, you should just be thinking about, so, you know, you have the monolingual sentence card, it comes up. It's just a sentence in the language. You read the sentence. Then you look at the back of the card. Then you read the definition. So then you want to ask yourself, did you understand more of the original sentence after you read the definition? If the answer is yes, then you want to fail the card, because it means that there's knowledge that's on the card that's not in your head. If you didn't understand the original sentence any better after you read the definition, then you might as well press good, because there's nothing to be gained by seeing the card more, because you already had in your head everything that there is to be gained. So you want to be really pragmatic about it like that. Like, it's not really about, like, did you meet some arbitrary goal or not? Because the deal is that, like, let's say a card comes up and you don't understand it, and then you read the back of the card and you still don't understand it. Well, then failing the card more isn't going to make you understand it, right? The point is that using what's on the back of the card, you become able to understand it. So even if you didn't understand the sentence or whatever, I mean, then it shouldn't, like, if you can't understand a sentence even after looking at the back of the card, then really you should delete it. But I'm just saying that you should, when you're using, let's say, the Loki Anki setup, there's two buttons, right? Pass and fail. If you press pass, you're going to see the card less often. If you press fail, you're going to see the card more often. So you got to think practically, am I going to benefit by seeing this card more often? If the answer is yes, then fail it. If the answer is no, then don't fail it. Because remember, the SRS is just a tool that has an algorithm that decides how often you should see certain cards. So you got to just be practically judge to yourself, would I benefit from seeing this card more? And if you, after looking at the back of the card, your understanding doesn't increase, that means that everything contained in the card that is relevant to you right now was already in your head, so you probably wouldn't benefit from seeing it anymore, so you want to press good. So it doesn't matter, but I will say that you don't try to memorize the definition, don't try to translate it, don't try to do anything like that. Mainly, you should just be focusing on, do I understand what the sentence means? All the situations where the sentence could be used in. and what the different parts of the sentence are doing and how they're interacting with each other. That's like mainly what you want to be focused on. It's really just a matter of, do I understand this, not have I memorized this. Ian Jarvis asks, "Hi Matt, can you please clarify 1K lazy kanji method? Do you recommend learning the first 1K of RTK in the regular order, learning the first 1K of RTK reordered in frequency, or just learning the first 1K of characters in order of frequency?" So none of those options, actually. What I recommend doing is learning the most frequently used 1000 kanji in RTK order. And I already have a deck that I made that is organized this way. You can find it on the MIA website if you go to Stage 1 Lazy Kanji. Basically, so Heisig has basically the 2000 most commonly used kanji, roughly, right? In an order that's unrelated to frequency, because the order has to do with how easy they are to learn in. And so I basically kept that order, but took out all the ones that are, or basically only left in the ones that are in the 1000 most common kanji. So that means that out of here, if here's 0 and here's 2000 of RTK, I took just some of them out all the way down to the end. So just to clarify, it's the 1000 most common kanji in RTK order. So Psycho asks, "Hey Matt, longtime weed smoker here, legal in my state. I've noticed that certain salvia strands help focus my attention on my immersion, particularly watching anime with no subs. Since I'm still at the beginner stage, it seems to make the many hours a day of incomprehensible input more enjoyable. Even doing the Anki reps in the morning, I find that my retention rate I find that as of yet, my retention rate has not suffered. I was wondering if this will end up hindering me in some way that I have not accounted for." So interesting question, but I don't think that anyone knows the answer to that question. If you're the type of smoker where you're still all there when you're high, then, I mean, there's no obvious reason to think that there would be any real detriments to being high while you immerse. Like, there's no real reason. If you really feel that you're noticing all the same things that you're noticing when you're sober, or perhaps even more, and that you're remembering, your memory is not affected, then there's no real reason to think that an hour of immersion when you're high is less valuable than an hour of immersion when you're sober. There's no obvious reason to think that, but I don't know, and I don't think anyone else knows. There's so little is known about language acquisition. Who knows if that would be, changing the way that your conscious interacts with your unconscious, or inhibiting the language acquisition center, or making it input harder to get in. And maybe it has the opposite effect. Maybe it'll make language acquisition go much more quickly. I think that's really just an area that's unknown. And so, of course, you're taking a risk by doing that, but anytime you do anything new, you're taking a risk. That's not necessarily a reason to not do it, because then we would never learn or discover anything new. So I will say that, I don't know, you are taking a risk, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's a bad decision, because there's no real obvious reason why it would get in the way if you do feel that you're paying just as close attention or more attention than usual, and it's not affecting your memory. So Jack Hardy asks, "Hey Matt, could you talk about developing a personality in Japanese? A lot of personality is humor, and from what I understand, there isn't sarcasm in Japanese, at least not like it is in English. So how does one develop their personality in a language that is fundamentally different from their L1? Well, I will say there's definitely sarcasm in Japanese, a lot. It's different than in English. It's not exactly the same, but there's definitely sarcasm. But anyway, I mean, as a prerequisite to developing a personality, you have to develop Japanese sensibilities, right? Like, when you're in your native country, out and about socializing, basically, there's part of your brain that's constantly monitoring the social situation and monitoring how well you are kind of doing in that social situation, right? So whenever you tell a joke, your mind will go like, oh, that was funny. Look, like people laughed, or like, oh, this, like, oh no, that was really, why did I say that? That was such a stupid thing to say. Or like, you know, oh, like whenever you think of something you might want to say, you judge it yourself, and you're like, oh, this is going to make me sound intelligent. Or, oh, this is going to be funny. This is going to make people laugh. Or like, oh, this will make people be interested in me. And you might not be thinking that this explicitly, but if you meditated a lot and you really paid attention, you notice that almost whenever you say anything, there's some sort of intention you have of why you're saying it. Like, there's some purpose to it, right? You're not just making random sounds with your mouth because the act of making sounds physically feels good. You're giving a certain message because you want it to have some sort of effect, whether that's to benefit you or to benefit other people or anything. It's not necessarily selfish. Your intention might be to genuinely help someone else, but there's always some sort of intention behind that, and then you're judging that the words that you're using are going to help your cause, whatever that is, right? Like if you're helping someone, you're thinking that it's going to help them. If you're going to trying to make someone laugh, you think that what you're saying is going to make them laugh. If you want them to like you, you're thinking that what you're going to say is going to like lead to them liking you. And so you need to basically have this sort of sensibility of grasping, what type of stuff is going to have what type of effect. And so before you can even start to develop a personality in Japanese, you have to have a sense for like, oh, if I said this type of thing, it would come across this way to this person who I'm talking to, or it would, have this sort of impression on them. And so basically you develop that through lots of immersion and through lots of analyzing and observing Japanese people and the Japanese language and how it's used, right? You see interactions between Japanese people and what effects different things have on each other, right? Like you can see, oh, this person said this in this situation, it seemed to have this effect on the people. And this isn't really a conscious thing. This is just something that your mind slowly observes for you and kind of learns for you as you get lots of immersion. And so once you have kind of really developed this sort of sensibility, then developing your personality just really comes naturally because you already know what type of impression you want to have on people, right? Like that doesn't really change from your native language. Like you can't have a personality, like you said, how does one develop their personality in a language that is, oh, never mind. I thought that it said, how do you develop a fundamentally different personality? But you just said in a language that's fundamentally different. So yeah, it's like your personality, what I just wanted to say was that your personality is different on a surface level, but it's not really going to be different on a fundamental level. Like the kind of person who you are is going to be the same. That's going to be expressed differently on the surface, to match that language and culture. And so once you understand Japanese sensibilities, then you'll naturally be able to figure out how to basically do all the same things you were doing in your native language, right? You'll kind of develop your own kind of sense of humor. And I mean, I think it will happen really naturally. I also think that it's going to be influenced by the type of things that you immerse with, especially in the beginning. If you watch a lot of a certain type of comedy in the beginning, that's probably going to permanently affect your sense of humor in Japanese and things like that, and your parents and stuff like that. Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of personality is kind of just arbitrary habits that you picked up from your parents or other people around you. Not all of it, maybe not even a lot of it, but definitely a certain portion of it. And so that's also kind of just going to develop naturally and almost arbitrarily depending on the type of stuff that you immerse with. And like humor in particular is really all about expectations, right? Like if you listen to old comedy that's not that funny, you'll realize that you can almost always tell what the punchline is before they've said the punchline. And that makes it not funny at all. Or even if you couldn't totally predict it, it seems like when they eventually do say the punchline, it seems really obvious, and so it's not entertaining to you at all. Also, and so basically, if something is predictable, stop texting me. If something's predictable, that's not going to be funny to you. But also, if it's too random and unpredictable, then it just feels arbitrary, and that's also not entertaining to you, right? Like if someone just started speaking in gibberish or saying random things that made no coherent sense, that wouldn't be interesting either. So in order for something to be funny, it has to break your expectations in a very specific, particular way. And, it has to be just beyond your ability to predict what was going to happen. And that sort of surprise element is what makes it funny. Now, that's a very kind of crude view of humor. Of course, it's more nuanced than that. But basically, in order to make other people laugh, you have to know what their expectations are so that you can break them in the perfect way. So you have to, in order to be funny in Japanese, you have to know what Japanese people are expecting in Japanese humor so that you can do something a little bit differently. Or do something a little bit different from that and then have that surprise element and make them laugh. So a lot of being funny in Japanese is just understanding the expectations of Japanese people. And that, again, is just a lot of immersion. And after a while, your brain will naturally start just coming up with things that would be funny. They're like, oh, in Japanese it would be funny to do this. And for me, it came very naturally. I mean, I was always someone who kind of liked to make jokes in the situation or whatever. But I definitely found just pretty naturally, whenever I was interacting with people, my brain would just feed me stuff. Be like, oh, look, this is going to be funny. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, I bet that is going to be funny. And I don't know where it comes from. It's just because my brain saw Japanese humor happen. It internalized the expectations and the sensibilities. And then now that it knew the language, it could just use it itself. So I'd say a lot of it comes down to just developing the Japanese sensibilities through immersion and maybe immersing with the type of stuff, like purposely giving yourself propaganda, like Kasumoto would say, to in kind of edge you in whatever direction you think you want to go in. And then I think it should come really naturally. It mostly just comes down to understanding the sensibilities. So last one, HampTC asks, will you share any more stories from school? So yeah, I figured I'd just share one story to end it off here. So I'm taking a Japanese poetry class this term in school. It's modern Japanese poetry, so that means around from the Meiji period, around 100 years ago. And it's written in classical Japanese grammar, the poetry from a year ago. It's like tanka, which is 31 syllables. So I think haikus are 17 syllables, right? Tanka are 31 syllables. And the first few weeks of class are just learning classical Japanese grammar because you have to know classical Japanese grammar to learn Japanese. And of course, all the other kids in the class are Japanese majors who are like third year, fourth year, and they don't know Japanese almost at all because they've done nothing but take classes and do the bare minimum textbook work and have had no immersion. So, of course, they're super slow and super bad at it. And I learned classical Japanese grammar like 2 years ago just for fun because I wanted to be able to, understand the little bits and pieces of classical Japanese that still exist within modern Japanese, like erabara shimono or like katte shitaru or kotowaza and things like that. And so I SRS'd it 2 years ago and I knew it really well for a period. And then after a while, I stopped using it in real life. It was just reviews in the SRS. And so I still knew it to a degree, but it got pretty rusty because, as you'll know if you use the SRS a lot, SRS cards alone aren't really enough to keep knowledge fresh. It keeps it from totally rotting away, but it's almost just like, let's say that you have ice cream in the freezer. So if you took that ice cream and you just put it out in room temperature, like you just put it on the table, it would melt very quickly. So that's like, you learn something, no SRS. You just stop using it. But if you keep it in the SRS, it's like moving it from the freezer into the fridge. It will melt a lot more slowly, but eventually it will still totally turn into liquid. So basically, my classical Japanese knowledge was slowly turning into liquid, but it was still there to a degree. But then I deleted my SRS 6 months ago. So I realized I forgot a lot. I completely forgot how to know what type of verb a verb was and how the verbs conjugate in classical Japanese and what all the meanings of all the different auxiliary verbs were. And so I was intending to relearn it eventually because I was missing not knowing it because I used to know it and it was cool to know it. That was one of the I talked earlier in this video about the downsides of deleting the SRS even once you're very fluent, and that was one of them. Is man, I remember when I used to know it's I couldn't remember. I was wait, which type of verbs can danuki happen to and which ones can't? I didn't know. I used to know that, you know? Whereas now I know it because I was restarting. It's like godon verbs don't have danuki. All the other types of verbs it can't have danuki. But anyway, so I went and like restudied Japanese. It only took like a weekend to like learn almost everything back because, you know, whenever, even if you forget something, if you knew it once, relearning it is a lot easier. And it hadn't been that long. So I got it back really quickly. And it was pretty fun, like restudying it over the weekend. Like I learned all the different types of verbs. I learned how to identify what type of verb a verb is just from modern Japanese knowledge of it. And so you could tell me any verb, and I could tell you right now what type of verb it is in modern Japanese and what type of verb it was in classical Japanese. Like, in like almost instantly, just through my knowledge of modern Japanese. And then a lot of stuff I realized I hadn't forgotten. I just forgot a few key things that made the whole thing fall apart. But once I learned some other stuff, a lot of it came back pretty quickly. And so it's pretty cool. I like after going back to class, it was like really hard just sitting there in class because the teacher will basically like put up a poem and then he'll call on someone and be like, hey, break down this poem for us grammatically. Like, what's going on here? And then like, if it was me, I could just do it in like 10 seconds, but it takes them like 4 minutes and then they're just like, and the teacher has to like walk them through it. And it's like really painful sitting there. But anyway, the interesting thing about this story is that, so the teacher is just a normal American guy, totally, you know, Caucasian guy. I think he has a Japanese wife, of course, but he has a PhD in either Japanese literature or something related to Japanese. And he's, you know, a college professor who like focuses on Japanese poetry for a living. But he's shown himself to not know Japanese as well as you might think. Like, not know classical Japanese as well as you might think, and especially modern Japanese. Because a lot of times he'll, like, look for an example, or, like, we'll be talking about a structure in classical Japanese, and he'll try to find an example in modern Japanese, and his example will be something that's super unnatural, and no one would ever say. Like, we were learning zu, like the negative zu, and then he had some example like, gohan o tabezu gakko ni ikimashita. Or something like that. Where it was like, okay, well, if you added ni, then that could work. Like, gohan o tabezu ni gakko ni ikimashita. But you can't just say, gohan o tabezu gakko ikimashita. That doesn't work in modern Japanese. But that was not the only example. He said multiple times where his modern day Japanese example, like, is not grammatically correct. Or just super unnatural. And also his accent, like, I knew before I took the class, I was like, man, I bet his pitch accent is going to suck. And that's going to bother me the whole class. But his accent is like so bad. It's like pitch accent isn't even relevant. Like he most of the time he says the R's like an English R. Like he says like renyoke and things like that instead of like renyoke or whatever. And so, I mean, maybe it's because he's speaking English, but even sometimes when he's like speaking a whole sentence in Japanese, he'll like just still be in like total English pronunciation mode. And so then also like one time he was like, we used this book, I can't have it in reach, but it's like meant for Japanese high school students, and so it has a classical Japanese poem and then explanation about the poem in modern day Japanese. And one time he was like reading part, like sometimes you can tell he's reading part of the modern Japanese explanation and he can't read a bunch of the kanji. Like he'll just like skip over some of it, and then one time I know there was the word kantan and he read it as kangeki. And by the way, there's Japanese graduate students in the class who are like actually Japanese. And they will correct him sometimes, but there's like a lot of things where he shows that he like doesn't really know modern Japanese that well. But then even with classical Japanese, like first of all, there's a few times where there was a verb that came up and he was like, okay, so first of all, we have to know what type of verb is this. I think it's either going to be a kami ichidan or a kami nidan. Let's look it up. And I was like, whoa, wait. You don't know that? Like, I could tell you, no, that's a kami nidan verb. It has to be. Because there's only 10 kami ichidan verbs, and that's not one of them. Or, like I, in my mind, like, over the weekend, like, easily came up with a way to instantly tell what type of verb is. I could teach it to anyone very quickly. Actually, might make a video on it just for fun. But he didn't know that, and this is, like, his job? It's like, what? And there's been multiple times where he didn't instantly know what type of verb a verb was, and he had to look it up on the chart. even though it's easy to know exactly what it is. And then also in classical Japanese, there's two different types of e adjectives, basically. There's like ku adjectives and then shiku adjectives, like kukatsuyo keiyoshi and shikukatsuyo keiyoshi. And it's really easy to tell which one's which. So if you take the modern day Japanese form, because you know how e adjectives, they all end in e, right? Takai, utsukushi. If you take off the e at the end, if the remaining last syllable is shi, then it's a shikukatsuyo keiyoshi. If it's not, then it's a kukatsuyo keiyoshi. So, utsukushi, take off the e, utsukushi. What's the last syllable? Shi. Okay, it's shikukatsuyo. Kurai, you take off the e, kura. Isn't shi? Okay, then it's kukatsuyo. It's that easy. But he didn't know that, and he didn't teach that to the class. He was like, okay, so kukatsuyo, they tend to be more about objective things like height or weight. Shikukatsuyo, they tend to be more about subjective states. And so that can be a good hint when you're trying to figure out which one it is. And I was like, no, you don't need any hints. It's like really obvious. And it took me a while. I was like, there's no way he doesn't know that. Well, he didn't seem to know that. And then the last thing that happened the last time I had class that was really just made me realize, like, wow, this is bad. So in classical Japanese, there are there's 9 different parts of speech in classical Japanese, or that's at least how they break it down in Japan. And so there's verbs, and then there's keiyo doshi, which are basically not adjectives, and then keiyoshi, which are basically e adjectives. And then there's particles, joshi, and then there's these things called auxiliary verbs, jodoshi, which are basically conjugating particles. So if you were going to say like tabemasu, taberu is the verb, tabe is the verb stem, and then mas is a jodoshi. And so jodoshi, right, are conjugating particles. So mas, mashita, mashite, it conjugates, right? Also, if you said taberareru, that would be tabe plus rareru, and rareru is a auxiliary verb. It conjugates rareru, rarete, rareta, or whatever. And so in classical Japanese, the past tense auxiliary verb is ki. So that would be the equivalent of ta, right? Like if you said like atta, it did exist. In classical Japanese, it would be ari ki. So ki is the past tense. And so it attaches on to what's called the renyoke. So that would be what in modern day Japanese is what you would attach mas onto. So like arimashita, ariki, right? Or tabemashita, tabeki. And so there's that. But like I said, auxiliary verbs have different forms that they can conjugate into. And so when the ki is ending a sentence, then it's going to be ki. But if the verb is attaching onto a noun, then it's going to be shi. So it's like ariki, but if you wanted to say like there was the person who was there, it would be arishi hito. And this actually exists in modern day Japanese. If you have like erabarashi mono, the chosen one, that shi in erabarashi is ki in rentaike, which is the conjugated form when it's attaching onto a noun. So it means erabarata hito. So the ending sentence form and the following and the preceding a noun form are the same in modern Japanese, but they're different in classical Japanese. And then there's also this other form that it has called the izenke, but that's not that important for now. So basically, normally ki attaches onto the renyoke of verbs. And no matter what form it's in, it attaches to renyoke. So it could be, ariki, arishi hito, erabariki, erabarashi hito. It always attaches onto renyoke. But there's 2 exceptions. It's when it attaches to kuru and suru, it has an irregular it attaches onto different forms. And so kuru is different, but just in this example we were talking about suru. So in classical Japanese, suru is actually just su, and the ru isn't there, and because that's one of its conjugated forms. So the renyoke, which would be where you add mas to, of suru, is shi, right? Shimasu. And so when let me try to have it right. Yeah, so ki, when it's in its the final form, the key form, it attaches onto shi to the renyo-kei of suru, just like any other verb. So ariki, shiki means shita, right? But the form when it attaches onto nouns, the rentai-kei, it attaches onto the mizen-kei of suru, which is se. So se, that would be the equivalent of saying like the mizen-kei is like when you put on nai. So like okora nai. So that okora is the mizen-kei, and in classical Japanese the mizen-kei of suru is se. And so this is probably really boring if you aren't into classical Japanese, but so basically, when the key has three forms, it has the normal form when it ends a sentence, the form before it when it precedes a noun, and then the izen-kei, which I just said a second ago. And so the normal form attaches onto the renyo-kei of suru, shiki. But the rentai-kei and the izen-kei, the other two forms, it attaches onto the mizen-kei, the tabenai form, that the nai, the one that nai would attach onto. So like, and that's se in Japanese. So it's seshi and seshika. So like, there was this other sentence, namida seshi hito. So namida suru means to cry, and so if you want to say namida shita hito, the person who cried, it was like namida seshi mono or whatever, namida seshi hito. And so there's this rule, right? When it's in its final form, it attaches onto susuru's renyo-kei. When it's in the rentai-kei, the preceding a noun form, or the izen-kei, it attaches onto the mizen-kei. But the teacher didn't know this rule. He was like, oh yeah, on suru, any form can attach onto any of the other forms. He was like, yeah, it's just alternate. It's like anyone can go. And he said that to the class. And I was like, wait, is he just simplifying it to make it easier for the kids, you know? And so I was like, well, isn't there actually technically the rule that the shushi-kei attaches onto the renyo-kei, and then the rentai-kei and the izen-kei attach onto the mizen-kei? And he was like, oh, really? I don't know. I'll have to look into that. And I was like, what? You don't know that? That's like a basic rule. This is like I learned that like within my first month of learning classical Japanese. But I guess if you don't have an SRS, because obviously you probably has never heard of an SRS, you just can't remember these little details. It's just all blurry to you. So, because that's the other thing I realized is like he can't actually read classical Japanese. He can't just like open up a document that was written 200 years ago and read it. He can decode it with a dictionary. But that's different than being able to read it. When you can read something, you just read it. It's intuitive. You've acquired it, you know? Being able to decode something means that after you look up a bunch of stuff and run a bunch of algorithms and formulas in your brain, you could translate it into a language that you can read. And that's what he can do, probably with modern Japanese and classical Japanese. But he can't actually read it. And it was really interesting to realize that, because I realized that if you wanted to learn how to just normally read classical Japanese, it wouldn't actually be that hard. You would just have to read it and make sentence cards. Like, that's literally it. And then maybe also like listen to audiobooks of like old classical Japanese stuff. And also, when I was at my old college 2 years ago, I talked to one of the Japanese professors there, who was like a really high level professor. He was like studying Edo, like documents from the Edo period. So I figured like, oh wow, this guy's like me from the future. He actually like got to the point where he can read classical Japanese normally. And I was like, my goal is to be able to read all of Japanese from every period, from the Manyoshu up until the Meiji period. I want to be able to read all of that. So what do you think the best strategy should I take? And I told him that I had this idea of I would basically just work backwards. Like first I would learn Mori Ogai, which is like 100 years ago, and then I could go to like or maybe older, maybe it's like 150 years ago or something. And then I would just go like back to 200 years and then 250 years ago, and I just slowly work backwards, and it would be like effortless because I would just naturally adapt to it as I went. And I could already read Mori Ogai a little bit because I had been doing, that was 2 years ago and I was really into classical Japanese. So I could like read Mori Ogai, which was written in classical Japanese grammar and was written like 150 years ago. And when I told the teacher about my plan and I asked him how to do it, what he said was no, that plan wouldn't work. Like if you taught yourself how to read Mori Ogai, then you'd basically just be learning how to read Mori Ogai, and that wouldn't transfer over to any of the other like authors. If you want to be able to read classical Japanese, you have to start in the Heian period and learn that, and then like learn all the other periods like in reference to that and like memorize all the differences, because the grammar slowly shifted over time, and so you have to have like a reference point to go back to. And that made sense to me, and I've actually heard Japanese scholars say the same thing. But what I'm thinking now is that advice doesn't apply to like learning how to actually read classical Japanese. That idea only applies to becoming able to decipher classical Japanese, which means like when you look shit up with a dictionary, you can figure it out. But if you actually wanted to acquire it, like to the point where it's completely intuitive and you can just read it normally, then I think that my plan actually would work very well. Because like now that I've been messing around with Japanese again and I've been listening to the like Gakumon no Susume audiobook. Gakumon no Susume, I think, is like around 100 years old. It's written in classical Japanese grammar. It's a very famous document. If you watched my my shadowing setup video, it's the thing that I shadowed at the end. That's why I shadowed it, is because I've been like listening to that to try to like drill in the classical Japanese grammar to my brain again. And I realized like, damn, I can actually understand this. Because although it's classical Japanese grammar, it's not really classical Japanese in the sense that it's basically modern Japanese with classical Japanese grammar. Like the meaning of all the individual words are about the same, and like the way that they phrase stuff is about the same. So it's like really easy for your brain to draw the connections, you know? And so I realized like, okay, well, if I kept listening to this, I could probably in a month, I could get to the point where I can understand this like perfectly effortlessly. Because I was like already at 85%, 90% comprehension. I just needed to like have my brain get used to the different conjugations and stuff. So then it's like, okay, well, if I could get used to that, well, then I could just go 50 years later, like, or earlier, and get used to that. And I realized like, if you want to actually acquire it, that's by far the easiest way. So just do it incrementally, let your brain get used to it, and then go another increment, let your brain get used to that. And of course, you wouldn't have that technical knowledge of being able to say like, oh yeah, this particle in like the year 1100, it was conjugated like this. In the year 1200, it was conjugated like that. But you'd still have an intuitive knowledge, like an intuitive ability to understand it all. You'd still be able to read it and just get it. And you'd intuitively get like, oh, in this period, this one must have conjugated like that instead of that. You know, it's just, I imagine, because when I learn, like if I watch a movie in Japanese where they're speaking a regional dialect that I've never heard before, it only takes me like a half an hour, or I should say it only takes my brain a half an hour to like decode the regional dialect, because it's only really different on the surface. And I mean, maybe this isn't the real regional dialect, maybe this is like a kind of like a watered down version for the movie, but there's normally like a 1-to-1 like correlation between a lot of stuff. Like I remember when I was watching the live action movie of Kids on the Slope, Sakamichi no Aporo, I think it was called. It took place in Kyushu, I think. And they had a pretty thick like Hogen. And I remember like instead of the O for like gohan o taberu, they used ba, so it was like gohan ba taberu. And on E adjectives, they would put ki instead of E, so it would be like, or no, ka instead of E, so it would be like yoka instead of like E. Like, ii ne would be like yokabai. And they put bai instead of like yo or whatever. And there was like a few other stuff. There was some stuff that took me a little bit longer than other stuff to figure out. But by like, you know, at the end of the movie, I could understand the dialect perfectly. My brain had already decoded it. And so I realized now it's like, if I went incrementally like that, I wouldn't need to read an explanation of how the grammar shifted. I would just be able to figure it out. It's really obvious, especially if you go incrementally, because although it's shifting, it's only really shifting on the surface. The underlying structures are the same. You know, they're saying the same types of stuff, just the actual words that they use to say those things are shifting. So I realized that, yeah, you actually could learn to probably understand like all of classical Japanese very easily and intuitively if you did just work your way backwards. But the thing would be that you'd have to be acquiring it as you go. You can't just memorize it, right? Like what the professors are trying to do at school, they don't even really know that acquisition is a thing, and they don't immerse at all. So instead, they're just trying to like build a mental model that lets them decode it. And they have their own way of doing that, and that's whatever. But if you actually wanted to be able to read it, like the people who lived at that time, and just read it normally like a document, you could actually do that, and it wouldn't be that hard. And I really want to do that, to like try to do that as an experiment. I'm going to do like 10,000 sentence cards, classical Japanese version. But I don't think I'm going to do that right now, because I'm like right in the middle of a giant, you know, pitch accent project where I'm trying to basically like master pitch accent and like gather a lot of data so that I can make a really comprehensive pitch accent resource. So like I'll probably have to put that to the side. Also, it's kind of useless to be able to understand all of classical Japanese. Like it sounds like a really fun project, and it would really deepen your understanding of modern Japanese, but it would have no practical benefits. It'd just be a fun thing to do on the side, but I'll still probably do it one day. But anyway, sorry for that super long ramble. Don't know, I don't think that was useful at all, but if you like listening to me ramble, then there you go. So, yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for patroning. Cool stuff to come. Make sure, you post your questions and stuff. Peace out, guys.